We are very excited to welcome in some expertise from just up the road from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. We've got Dr. Alex Scott joining us for a really interesting conversation about Scope 3 emissions and sustainability, specifically in our domestic supply chain space. So, Dr. Scott, thank you so much for being here today as part of our Domestic Supply Chain Summit.
Hello, Kaylee. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So the work that you guys do at UT Knoxville is really important when it comes to kind of developing, understanding where emissions really fall in the supply chain space. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about where you guys play in some of that academic assumptions and academic assessments of emissions and sustainability?
Yes. So one of the big initiatives that we have over the last year or two is to increase the visibility into the sustainability of the transportation sector, particularly the trucking, LTL truckload sector. As you know, it's a huge sector with hundreds of thousands of different companies out there. So it's a big source of emissions in supply chains. And so what we are trying to do is give shippers and brokers and 3PLs insights into the sustainability profile of all of these carriers out there on the road so that they can consider that in their decision making. Right? You got price, you have service, you have safety, which are all traditional things that shippers and brokers have cared about. But now we think sustainability should also be considered. So we are trying to enable.
It's no small undertaking, especially in the transportation space where supply chains are very long and very difficult, especially if you look at talking international supply chains versus domestic supply chains. You have so many different players, and measuring your emissions, whether that's Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3, is very much not an easy task. For a while now, I think a lot of carriers have had a pretty decent grasp on what their Scope 1 emissions are, what the things they're directly responsible for actually look like. But when it comes to Scope 2 and Scope 3, things get a little bit murky. Can you talk to why that is and maybe where some of that increased visibility really needs to be focused?
Yes. So the Scope 3 emissions in particular are challenging, and particularly challenging in the trucking sector is because there are so many carriers out there. So keeping track of this and getting that type of information is very challenging. So if you are a shipper and you use a broker, and that broker may have 10 or 20,000 carriers that they use. So how can that shipper then quantify their emissions of the carriers they are using in their supply chain is very challenging because you have a couple layers and you have many, many different companies of which collecting and keeping that data is challenging. And so that is really the big challenge for Scope 3 emissions, and we are providing insight into it.
So for that Scope 3 level, a lot of the, kind of willingness to track that deep comes from a regulatory standpoint. We're seeing more states now enact legislation that says you have to keep a hold of your Scope 3 emissions, specifically thinking about California and some of their most forward-thinking emissions rules. They tend to be a little bit more forward-thinking than some of our other states, and definitely more so than the federal government. But as we mentioned, those really long, complex supply chains get a little bit murky in the regulation. If you are a shipper who produces something in California, but your components or your input components come from overseas, you still have to track that as part of your Scope 3. If you're a shipper in California who puts your stuff on a rail and it goes to Chicago and then gets on a truck, you still got to track that as part of your Scope 3. When we're talking about regulatory environments like this, what are some of the kind of nuances in either language or regulation that comes out that really determines how thorough a shipper has to be in handling all of that data?
Yes, so this is a big challenge. So you have, I would say, 4 different directions this is coming from. One, you have rules in the EU that have been adopted and are coming into play. 2, as you mentioned, California has rules that have passed legislature and have been indicated by the governor that they will be signed. So those will affect pretty much every big company. 3, you have the SEC considering rules. We don't know what the SEC will decide, but they are considering Scope 3 emissions. And then the 4th is just voluntary pledges, right? I'm sure you've heard about all these net zero pledges or sustainability pledges. Well, if you make that pledge, what goes hand in hand with that is actually measuring those emissions and hopefully trying to hit those pledges. So you have this coming from a variety of angles, and you also then have a variety of rules and regulations. So the EU regulations don't look exactly the same as the California regulations. We don't know what the SEC regulations will look like. You have different standards boards, like one is called the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB. So I've read through that in high detail. That uses another document called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that's another kind of that builds upon the ISSB. And then you have this whole other segment. One is called GLEC, GLEC, and I don't remember what that stands for off the top of my head. But there's GLEC, and that also uses ISO standards, ISO 14083, I think, something like that. So there's at least 3 or 4 different standards out there. There's different rules out there. So which ones do we have to use? What is good practice for measuring your emissions? This is a really big challenge for companies. And I've read some that there are some complaints by different business people that, well, what are we supposed to do? Give us guidance. And so I think there needs to be some standardization. And that's, again, that's one thing we are trying to do. Let's standardize. So think about the trucking space. It's a perfect area for standardization. Tons of shippers, tons of carriers. Why should they all do different things? They should all do the same thing so that we can compare apples to apples. But yes, there's a variety of different rules and regulations out there, different standards. And I think we really need to get clarity on that over the next 6 months to a year.
It's very broad, and that kind of broad and obscureness of it, as you mentioned, makes it very difficult to measure your emissions. And if you can't measure them, you can't manage them correctly. And here in the United States, we'll bring it back and kind of cut out the EU standards because, of course, this is the Domestic Supply Chain Summit. We are now, of course, looking at a federal goal for net zero emissions by 2050. A lot of people say that that's not feasible. That's 25 years if we round up here, to 2025. That's 25 years to get all of us at this net zero emissions level. And without having a true understanding on what that looks like from a transportation space, I don't think that date is legitimately feasible from a national standard. When we talk about now reducing your scope 3 and getting there, it's scope 1 first, scope 2 second, then scope 3 third. For a company who's maybe looking to start that journey or get kind of a grasp on what they can do to reduce their emissions, where do they begin? Is it looking internally first and then reaching out down their supply chain? Or is it kind of taking a broad picture and then narrowing down piece by piece?
Yeah, so there is no silver bullet, as you kind of alluded to. It takes energy to move something from one location to another. So somehow energy has to be expended, and usually with that energy are some emissions. There's things like electric trucks that are being pushed. Does that work really in the Class 8 heavy truck space? I'd say that's largely unproven and several years off, at least several years off, if it's ever really truly a game changer. And the other issue with electric trucks is, well, they still have emissions. That just pushes it to the power plant, right, where the charging comes from. There's other types of things like ammonia and hydrogen, which are being experimented with. But again, those are several years off. So the question is, what in the short and medium term can shippers do? Well, we can look at federal policy over the last 10, 15 years, thing called the Clean Trucks Program, where clean trucks have been mandated by the federal government and produced by manufacturers, right? So all the big, the big 3 or 4 manufacturers of trucks have improved aerodynamics. They've gotten weight out of the trucks. They've improved the drivetrains, a variety of different factors to make these trucks cleaner over time. So if you compare, let's say a model year 2022 versus, let's say, a model year 2010. So 10 to 12 year difference, right? And those model 2010s, a lot of those are still on the road. Those have an emissions profile that can be 20 to 30% higher than the newer trucks. So newer trucks are cleaner, and that continues to get better. And so to marginally improve in the short term your emissions as a shipper, well, you can avoid those really dirty carriers, right? And so that is a short-term strategy that can be done today. And that is one of the things we provide insight and visibility into, is that you can now look at individual carriers and say, okay, I see the trucks they're operating. They are 20% higher emissions than these other carriers. And so if you can avoid those carriers or incentivize them in some way to update and clean their equipment, then that can reduce your emissions, on the 5, 10, 15% level. Of course, you're not going to get to net zero for some major change that we don't have in the near future.
So you're, of course, alluding to that visibility aspect of it. And you guys have actually created a tool to allow companies to see more clearly into where they can find sustainable options. You guys have this Fleet Sustainability Index. Can you talk to me a little bit about the creation of that index and kind of where it works, who it works for, and The ease of access for it, because I think that's something else that is kind of a limiting factor to people understanding how to reduce their emissions, is they feel like it's inaccessible to either find data or find choices to make for cleaner carriers. And the Fleet Sustainability Index kind of removes some of those barriers.
Yes, absolutely. We've spent a lot of time in the last 6 months to a year developing this and making it very accessible. So right now it's a web application. Literally anybody with that can get access to it in their own homes or in their own offices. And what this does is this provides insight scores somewhere around 400,000 carriers. So if you want to look at the emissions profile based on the actual equipment those carriers use, right? So we are looking at their trucks and scoring them based on their trucks and the class of trucks and the type of fuel that's used and those types of factors. And so a shipper or a broker or whomever can go to that web app and look up any carriers they're using, and they could get actual data on the actual trucks those carriers are using. We have done this with a couple of large brokers, and the hit rate we have seen is in the 97 to 99% range. So meaning they submit 1,000 loads, you're hitting about 99% of those loads are returning with data that we can provide and is actionable and based on actual trucks and data on the roads. So, I think the solution's there now, and that's literally only come out in the last month or two.
I love that. And how many people are now using this Fleet Sustainability Index? And what's the hope for you guys to grow it into the future? I think that's a good kind of place to wrap it up, right? Is hopeful for the future.
Yes. So we have several proof of concepts that we've done with 5 to 10 different customers who have used it and have been happy with it. We think that this can be widely adopted. We think this can solve an industry-wide problem, and it can do it very efficiently and relatively low cost. And so we think the solution for this industry is out there, and so we hope for wider adoption. But like I said, it's early days, but we hope to get.
So as people are looking to maybe check out the Fleet Sustainability Index, whether that's to use it just for their own decision making or help you guys out by providing some more loads and some more data, where can they go to do that? And should they reach out to you if they've got questions?
Yes, they can always reach out to me at my email, which I'm happy to provide. We also have a website, which is called www.sustainlog.com. Our name of the company is Sustainable Logistics, so sustainlog.com. You can go to that website. We have a web app there with links to the web app there that shippers can use. And, my email is alex@sustainlog.com or ascott@utk.edu, right? So I'm here and easy to be found.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Scott, thank you so much for joining us for the Domestic Supply Chain Summit. And thank you again for creating now this very actionable, very accessible thing for people to see some of their sustainability goals.
Thank you for having me, Kaylee.
Absolutely. And thank you all for staying tuned for our Domestic Supply Chain Summit as well. We've got plenty more content coming up throughout the rest of our day-to-day. Make sure that you are staying active in our live chat there on live.freightwaves.com and enjoy the rest of the show.